Thanks for watching. When this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a special giveaway, and one lucky new subscriber will win an iPhone 15 Pro Max. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss your chance.
By the 90th day, survival had stopped feeling like a temporary state. It had weight, structure, and rhythm. I marked time without calendars, tracking it through wear patterns, inventory cycles, and the way my body responded to effort. The early chaos had burned itself out long ago. What remained was quieter, slower, and easier to manage. Or so it seemed. My safe place had proven itself repeatedly. It had held through storms, through shortages, through the first waves of infected that wandered too close and eventually drifted away. Nothing breached the perimeter. Nothing forced me to flee. That consistency built confidence in ways I didn't question at the time. Confidence felt earned after 90 uninterrupted days. Every system I relied on had settled into predictability. Food storage rotated cleanly. Water access remained secure. Power solutions, improvised and layered, delivered just enough without attracting attention. I had learned the balance between use and visibility, consumption and exposure. Nothing was wasted. Nothing felt rushed. The routines mattered more than the shelter itself. I woke at the same time every day, not by alarm, but by instinct. Mornings were for inspection, seals, locks, lines of sight. Afternoons were for maintenance and inventory. Nights were quiet by design, reduced movement, controlled light, deliberate stillness. The world outside could deteriorate as much as it wanted. Inside, order held. I trusted that order. Trust crept in gradually, disguised as efficiency. I stopped scanning the horizon as often. I stopped listening as hard. The absence of immediate threat trained me to expect continuity rather than disruption. When nothing bad happened day after day, caution softened into habit. The safe place responded to that shift. Not actively, but passively. The more predictable my behavior became, the more the environment felt compliant. Doors opened smoothly. Routes remained clear. Storage stayed accessible. It felt cooperative, like a partnership between planning and outcome. I told myself that was the reward for doing things right. 90 days had also changed how I remembered the beginning. Panic felt distant, almost exaggerated. The frantic movement, the desperate improvisation, the constant fear of noise and exposure now seemed inefficient, even reckless. I believed I had evolved past that phase. The safe place had allowed me to refine survival into something sustainable. That belief shaped my decisions more than I realized. I stopped planning exits as frequently. I stopped rehearsing emergency movement scenarios. The shelter wasn't just a fallback anymore. It was the plan. I reinforced that idea through repetition. Every successful night without incident confirmed it. Every morning without loss strengthened it. Survival wasn't something I was still proving. It was something I had achieved. The outside world faded into abstraction. I knew it was dangerous, but danger had become theoretical rather than immediate. I could hear distant sounds sometimes, faint reminders that collapse hadn't reversed itself, but they never reached me. Distance became insulation, both physical and mental. I began thinking in terms of longevity instead of escape. How long could I stay here comfortably? How long could supplies last if nothing changed? How long before improvement became necessary rather than urgent? Those questions carried an assumption I didn't examine, that staying was the default. 90 days gave me that assumption. It felt justified. Most people never made it this far. Most shelters failed early, exposed by poor planning or bad luck. Mine hadn't. Mine worked. That success reframed risk. I no longer measured danger by possibility. I measured it by deviation. Anything that threatened routine felt more dangerous than the infected themselves. Stability became the goal, not adaptability. Looking back, that was the shift that mattered most. The moment survival stopped being reactive and started being controlled. Control felt like safety. Control felt like progress. I didn't yet see how control could turn inward, how systems built to protect could begin to limit instead. All I saw was 90 days of evidence that I had done something right. The safe place had carried me this far. I believed it would carry me further. That belief wasn't irrational. It was simply incomplete. The reason the refuge succeeded wasn't luck, and it wasn't secrecy alone. It was alignment. Every advantage it offered fit together cleanly, reducing friction instead of introducing it. I had chosen it early for practical reasons, but over time those reasons compounded into something that felt dependable. Location mattered first. The structure sat away from major routes without being isolated from them, close enough to access what I needed, but far enough to avoid constant movement. Lines of approach were limited, not blocked entirely, which meant nothing funneled toward me by accident. The infected drifted past rather than congregated. Human traffic, when it still existed, bypassed the area entirely. Construction mattered just as much. The place wasn't built to look secure. It simply was. Thick materials, few openings, and a layout that favored internal visibility over external exposure. I didn't need elaborate fortifications because the geometry itself discouraged intrusion. Every potential entry point was obvious, and obvious threats are easier to plan around than hidden ones. Access was controlled without feeling restrictive. I could move freely inside without crossing choke points that forced hesitation or noise. Storage areas were separated logically, which meant inventory stayed organized without constant adjustment. I wasn't fighting the space. I was using it the way it wanted to be used. Resources reinforced that harmony. Water came from a source that didn't depend on pressure grids or constant power draw. Food storage fit the environment instead of overwhelming it. Energy solutions were layered, not centralized, so failure in one system never cascaded into another. Nothing was optimized to the point of fragility. The surrounding terrain played its part as well. Natural barriers redirected movement without advertising themselves. Elevation changes broke sightlines and sound paths. Weather worked in my favor more often than against me, masking activity and limiting travel during critical hours. I didn't need to outthink the environment. I let it do some of the work. What made the place truly effective, though, was how little it demanded. It didn't require constant reinforcement or daily upgrades to remain viable. Maintenance was preventative rather than reactive. When something needed attention, it announced itself early through small changes I could address before they escalated. There were no surprises. That predictability encouraged efficiency. I refined routines until they fit the space precisely. Tools stayed where they were most useful. Supplies rotated without effort. Movement paths minimized overlap and noise. Over time, everything settled into a pattern that felt natural, almost inevitable. The refuge didn't just protect me from the outside. It protected me from poor decisions. Its limitations prevented excess. Its simplicity discouraged over-engineering. When I considered changes, the space itself filtered them, making some ideas feel unnecessary before I ever acted on them. I compared it often, mentally, to other places I'd seen fail. Shelters that promised too much, that relied on complexity or aggressive defenses. Those places demanded constant attention and invited mistakes. Mine stayed quiet. Quiet became its strongest feature. I told myself this was proof of good planning. And it was, to an extent. But the success also bred attachment. The more the refuge worked, the more I trusted it implicitly. I stopped evaluating alternatives because nothing else offered the same balance of effort and reward. That trust extended beyond structure and supply. It shaped how I thought about threat. If something couldn't penetrate this place easily, I discounted it. If a problem didn't immediately disrupt routine, I delayed addressing it. The refuge had earned my confidence, and confidence narrowed my focus. I reinforced that mindset by improving what already existed instead of imagining what might fail. Stronger barriers, cleaner organization, more efficient use of space. Each improvement deepened my dependence without feeling like a concession. The place worked because it fit the moment I chose it. It fit my needs when survival demanded stability above all else. I didn't question whether those needs might change. I assumed success would scale forward naturally. That assumption rested on one idea I never challenged, that safety was something you secured once and then maintained. I believed the refuge's strengths were fixed qualities, not conditions dependent on time, habit, and pressure. 90 days of success made that belief feel reasonable. The place hadn't failed me yet. Every problem had been manageable, every threat had passed without consequence. Why this place worked seemed obvious. It worked because it was right. I didn't yet consider that something could be right at the beginning and wrong later, not because it changed, but because I did. The change was so minor that I didn't recognize it as a decision at all. It felt more like an optimization, the kind you make when a system has proven reliable enough to justify refinement. Nothing about it seemed reckless. If anything, it felt responsible. It started with timing. I adjusted when I secured one of the exterior barriers, delaying it by an hour to make evening movement easier. The difference was negligible in theory. The infected never came that close anymore, and human presence in the area had dropped to almost nothing. Leaving it open longer saved effort and reduced noise during the most sensitive part of the night. I told myself it was smarter. That logic extended naturally to other routines. I shortened inspection cycles, skipping checks that hadn't revealed issues in weeks. Locks that never showed signs of tampering received less attention. Sightlines that had remained clear for months no longer felt urgent to scan. Familiarity replaced verification. The refuge didn't resist these changes. Nothing went wrong immediately. Doors still closed when I needed them to. Supplies remained where I left them. Nights passed without disturbance. Each uneventful outcome reinforced the idea that my adjustments were justified. Efficiency felt like progress. I began favoring convenience in small ways. Tools stayed out instead of being returned to storage. Pathways that reduced steps but increased exposure became acceptable because exposure hadn't been punished. I moved faster, quieter in practice, but less deliberate in thought. The margin between control and comfort narrowed without triggering alarm. What made the compromise dangerous wasn't the action itself, it was the reasoning behind it. I had shifted from asking whether something was necessary to asking whether it was still inconvenient. That was a subtle inversion, but it mattered. Survival logic had stopped being defensive and started being accommodating. I noticed the effect most clearly at night. I allowed myself more light for longer periods, convinced that the surrounding environment masked it well enough. The glow felt contained, controlled. I forgot that containment had always depended on conditions outside my control. Habit replaced calculation. The refuge absorbed these changes easily. It didn't punish deviation, it adapted around it. That adaptability became part of the problem. When nothing pushes back, it's easy to assume limits don't exist. I justified each adjustment individually. No single change compromised safety. No single decision crossed a line. Taken together, though, they altered the balance. The refuge had worked because it demanded discipline. I was teaching it to tolerate less of that discipline in exchange for comfort. The most telling compromise involved sound. I stopped waiting for optimal windows to move between sections of the shelter. Instead, I relied on familiarity with ambient noise, trusting my instincts to judge when movement was safe. Instinct had kept me alive early on. but instinct dulls when it's not challenged. Silence felt permanent rather than conditional. Nothing happened the first time I moved carelessly. Or the second. The absence of consequence became evidence. I mistook luck for stability. I told myself this was what long-term survival looked like. Adaptation, efficiency, reducing unnecessary strain. I framed it as evolution rather than erosion. After 90 days, surely I had earned some margin. That belief reshaped how I viewed the refuge itself. It wasn't just a place that required discipline anymore. It was a place that forgave mistakes. Forgiveness is comforting, but it invites repetition. I didn't notice how the refuge had begun to dictate my behavior in return. By accommodating convenience, it encouraged it. By allowing shortcuts, it made them feel safe. The system I had built around vigilance started optimizing for ease instead. The first compromise didn't announce itself as danger. It arrived quietly, wrapped in reason, reinforced by success. I didn't feel less safe afterward. I felt more settled. That was the warning I missed. The safe place hadn't changed. Its walls were the same. Its layout was unchanged. What shifted was my relationship to it. I stopped treating safety as something that had to be re-earned every day and started treating it as something I possessed. That assumption rested on the past, not the future. The first small compromise wasn't about security at all. It was about trust. Trust that nothing would change if I relaxed. Trust that 90 days of success meant the next 90 would behave the same. I carried that trust forward without testing it. By the time I realized the refuge was responding to my behavior rather than the other way around, the habit had already formed. The compromise had become routine, and routine, once established, is harder to break than fear ever was. That was how safety began to shift into something else. Not suddenly, not violently, but through a series of decisions that felt harmless precisely because they worked. Until one day, they didn't. Routine crept in the way weather does when you stop checking the forecast. I didn't decide to become less aware. I simply stopped needing to be alert every moment. The refuge rewarded consistency, and consistency gradually replaced attention. Tasks blurred into sequences I could perform without conscious effort, freeing my thoughts while quietly narrowing them. Mornings unfolded automatically. I moved through inspection points in the same order, touching the same surfaces, glancing at the same markers. When nothing changed, my eyes learned what to ignore. The human brain is efficient that way. It filters out what doesn't demand reaction, and over time, silence becomes confirmation rather than absence. I noticed I no longer paused to listen before opening interior barriers. I knew how long it took for sounds to carry, how the environment behaved at certain hours. That knowledge felt reliable. It let me move faster, smoother, with fewer interruptions. Speed became another form of comfort, even though comfort had never been part of the original plan. Awareness faded first at the edges. I stopped scanning peripheral zones as carefully, trusting that nothing had approached unnoticed for weeks. Exterior checks shortened, not skipped, but condensed into visual sweeps rather than methodical reviews. When you see the same emptiness often enough, you stop expecting change. The refuge encouraged this without intention. Its stability masked small variations that once would have drawn scrutiny. A shifted shadow, a sound out of sequence, a smell that didn't belong. Early on, those details had triggered investigation. Now they registered as anomalies without urgency, easily dismissed if they didn't repeat. Repetition trained me more effectively than fear ever had. The more often routines succeeded, the less justification I felt for questioning them. I began measuring days by completion rather than observation. If tasks were finished and nothing went wrong, the day counted as a success. That metric rewarded efficiency over curiosity. I caught myself multitasking during moments that once demanded full focus. Inventory checks overlapped with listening. Maintenance overlapped with planning meals. Attention fractured into layers, each receiving just enough awareness to function. Nothing failed immediately, which reinforced the behavior. The most dangerous shift involved nights. Early on, darkness had sharpened my senses. Now it dulled them. I knew when it was safe to move. I knew when to remain still. The rules felt internalized. I stopped consciously applying them and started relying on intuition, built from repetition rather than active assessment. Intuition isn't flawed by nature, it's flawed by context. Mine had been trained in an environment that hadn't challenged me in weeks. It responded to patterns that no longer guaranteed safety. The absence of recent threat taught it the wrong lesson. The refuge itself didn't change, but my interaction with it did. I moved more freely, more often, creating predictable patterns without realizing it. Paths worn by repetition became habits. Habits became expectations. If something had observed me, it wouldn't have needed intelligence to anticipate my behavior. I didn't consider that possibility because awareness had shifted inward. I focused on maintaining internal order rather than observing external conditions. The world beyond the refuge felt static, paused at a safe distance. I treated it as background rather than variable. This was the paradox of long-term survival. Success made me efficient. Efficiency reduced friction. Reduced friction hid warning signs. The smoother everything felt, the less feedback I received that something might be wrong. Routine became a shield against anxiety. I followed it not just because it worked, but because it relieved me of constant decision-making. Each completed task reinforced the sense that control was intact. Control felt like safety, even when it wasn't being tested. I realized later that awareness doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes through delegation. I delegated vigilance to habit. I trusted yesterday's outcomes to predict today's conditions. I let the refuge think for me by assuming it would behave the same way tomorrow as it had today. Nothing about that felt dangerous at the time. It felt earned. 90 days of survival had given me proof that effort paid off. I believed routine was the natural evolution of that effort, the next logical stage. What I didn't see was that routine had replaced questioning, and questioning had always been the thing that kept me alive. By the time I noticed the difference, awareness had already been outpaced by habit. I was still doing everything right according to yesterday's rules. I just wasn't watching closely enough to see when those rules stopped applying. The refuge hadn't failed me. I had stopped checking whether it could. I didn't notice the shortage when it began. Shortages announce themselves with gaps, with empty shelves or sudden need. This one arrived disguised as balance. Inventory counts stayed within acceptable ranges, but the margins thinned quietly, shaved down by small decisions that made sense in isolation. I tracked consumption the way I always had, logging use and projecting forward. On paper, nothing was wrong. Food remained. Water stayed secure. Power reserves held. The problem wasn't quantity, it was flexibility. Every category now depended on the refuge functioning exactly as expected. There was no slack left to absorb surprise. I saw it first in food rotation. Early on, I had treated stored supplies as temporary, something to be replaced or supplemented through scavenging. Now replacement had slowed to a trickle. Trips outside felt unnecessary, risky for little gain. Instead of expanding stores, I maintained them. Maintenance feels responsible until it becomes stagnation. Calories stretched differently when movement declined. I burned less, so consumption dropped. That looked efficient, but it also meant fewer opportunities to notice change. Packages lasted longer, which delayed the realization that variety had vanished. Diet narrowed. Nutrition became functional rather than resilient. The system worked only as long as nothing disrupted it. Water told a similar story. Access remained constant, but redundancy faded. I relied on a single treatment method because it had never failed me. Backup options sat untouched, untested, assumed viable because they always had been. Assumptions calcify when they're never challenged. Power revealed the problem most clearly. I had layered solutions early, but over time I favored the most convenient source. It required the least attention, the least noise, the least adjustment. Other systems became backups in name only. I stopped cycling them regularly. When redundancy stops being exercised, it stops being real. I noticed my planning language change. I stopped asking how long supplies would last if something went wrong. I asked how long they would last if nothing changed. That question assumed stability. It assumed the refuge would continue behaving as it always had. It treated disruption as unlikely rather than inevitable. The safe place encouraged that mindset. Its reliability masked depletion. As long as I stayed within its rhythms, it provided exactly what I needed, no more, no less. There was comfort in that precision. There was danger in it too. I tested expansion once, considering a longer scavenging run to rebuild margins. The idea felt excessive. Why risk exposure when nothing demanded it? That reasoning won. The margins stayed thin. What I didn't acknowledge was how thin they'd become. Supplies no longer stretched beyond routine. They matched it. Any deviation, illness, injury, unexpected need, would cut into reserves immediately. There was no buffer to protect me from myself. The refuge had shifted from being a base to being a limiter. It defined how much I could safely consume, how far I could plan, how much variation I could tolerate. I hadn't lost supplies. I had lost options. That loss didn't feel urgent. It felt manageable. Manageable things rarely trigger action. They invite delay. I continued optimizing within the same boundaries, unaware that optimization without expansion is a slow form of entrapment. The system grew more efficient and less forgiving at the same time. It worked beautifully as long as I stayed exactly where I was. Supplies didn't stretch anymore because I had stopped stretching the system that supported them. Everything fit too well, and when something fits perfectly, there's no room to move when it needs to change. I marked the numbers, closed the logs, and told myself I would address it later. Later always felt available when today looked stable. The refuge didn't object. It never did. By the time I realized supplies weren't the problem, but dependency was, the habit had already formed. The safe place no longer supported survival beyond itself. It demanded it remain the center of every decision. That was when I understood that shortages don't always announce collapse. Sometimes they signal commitment, quietly narrowing the path until turning around feels impractical. I still had food, I still had water, I still had power. What I was losing was the ability to imagine life beyond the walls that provided them. The first day I skipped going out, it felt like a reward. Weather was unstable, the risk wasn't worth the return, and I had everything I needed inside. Choosing not to leave felt like evidence that the refuge was working exactly as intended. Independence meant not having to expose myself unnecessarily. That reasoning repeated itself easily. Each time I considered a run beyond the perimeter, the calculation ended the same way. Supplies held. No immediate need presented itself. The outside remained unpredictable, loud, and full of variables I no longer needed to manage daily. Staying in felt disciplined, rather than cautious. I began measuring risk differently. Early on, risk was balanced against necessity. Now it was balanced against comfort. The refuge offered controlled conditions, predictable outcomes, and fewer decisions. Outside offered none of that. The longer I stayed in, the less incentive I felt to challenge that contrast. I told myself I was conserving energy. I told myself I was reducing exposure. Both were true but incomplete. What I was really doing was allowing the refuge to become the default state rather than one option among many. The outside didn't disappear. It simply stopped factoring into my planning. Scouting became theoretical. I watched from a distance, listening instead of moving, observing through barriers rather than crossing them. The world beyond the safe place turned into a concept rather than a space I actively navigated. That distance bred assumptions. I assumed patterns remained the same. I assumed threats stayed external. The refuge encouraged that detachment by functioning flawlessly. Every day spent inside without incident reinforced the idea that leaving was unnecessary. The longer I stayed, the less current my understanding of the outside became. Information aged quickly. What I knew about the world beyond my walls was always a few days out of date. That lag didn't feel dangerous at first. It felt like insulation. I wasn't reacting to every sound or movement anymore. I was insulated from chaos, and insulation felt like progress. I didn't notice that it also limited my ability to adapt if conditions changed suddenly. I stopped planning routes. Maps stayed rolled. Exit paths existed in memory rather than rehearsal. Familiarity with the refuge deepened while familiarity with the outside faded. I could navigate every inch of my safe place in darkness. Beyond it, details blurred. The most subtle shift came when I realized I no longer looked forward to going out. Early scavenging runs had carried tension, but also clarity. They sharpened focus. Now the idea felt like interruption. Leaving would break routine, introduce noise, force decisions I had learned to avoid. Avoidance masqueraded as strategy. I convinced myself that minimizing exposure was the smartest move. That logic held only as long as the refuge remained stable. Stability became a prerequisite rather than an assumption, but I treated it as guaranteed. I ignored the cost of isolation. Staying inside reduced not just risk, but information. I didn't see how the infected moved anymore. I didn't track changes in human activity. I didn't notice shifts in sound patterns beyond my immediate surroundings. The outside evolved without my input. The refuge slowly stopped being a place I returned to. It became the entirety of my operational world. Decisions revolved around it exclusively. Any scenario that required leaving felt hypothetical, distant, almost unreasonable. That was the moment the trap began forming, though I didn't recognize it yet. Traps don't always close with force. Sometimes they close by making alternatives feel unnecessary. The outside becoming optional didn't mean I couldn't leave. It meant I didn't want to. And once desire disappears, capability follows quietly behind it. I still told myself I could go any time. The door wasn't blocked. The path wasn't sealed. But the mental resistance had grown strong enough that physical barriers were no longer needed. The safe place had done more than protect me. It had replaced the world. By the time I realized how rarely I looked beyond its walls, the habit was already set. Leaving wasn't forbidden. It just wasn't part of the plan anymore. That was when safety began to resemble confinement. Not because something had closed in, but because everything outside had slowly fallen away from relevance. Silence stopped being a precaution and became a rule. It wasn't enforced by fear or immediate threat, but by the growing understanding that sound now carried consequences I couldn't afford. The refuge had always benefited from discretion, but over time discretion hardened into constraint. I reduced noise in stages. At first, it was just common sense, moving slower, cushioning contact points, timing actions to environmental cover. Then it became policy. Tools were wrapped, containers padded. Even breathing adjusted during moments when stillness mattered most. Silence wasn't about hiding from something specific anymore. It was about avoiding attention from anything at all. The structure responded to quiet in subtle ways. Vibrations dissipated cleanly. Interior echoes softened. The place felt smaller when it was silent, more enclosed, as if sound had once been propping the space open. Without it, the refuge folded inward. compressing activity into narrow windows. Light followed the same path. I dimmed it not because brightness was dangerous, but because darkness demanded less movement. Less movement meant less sound. I memorized layouts well enough to navigate without illumination, relying on touch and spacing instead of sight. The refuge became something I felt rather than saw. Silence began to shape behavior. Actions were no longer chosen for efficiency alone, but for how little disturbance they caused. Tasks that required noise were postponed. Maintenance compressed into single sessions to avoid repeated exposure. Comfort yielded to concealment without protest because nothing challenged the trade. I realized how far this had gone the first time I hesitated to cough. The reflex caught in my chest, measured against risk instead of health. That calculation would have seemed absurd earlier. Now it felt automatic. Safety demanded restraint at the level of instinct. The refuge didn't require this silence explicitly. No alarms punished noise. No immediate consequence followed the occasional mistake. That absence made the rules stronger. Silence became a habit reinforced by imagination rather than evidence. The cost of breaking it felt infinite because it was undefined. I began noticing sounds I couldn't place. Faint disturbances that might have been wind, or distant movement, or nothing at all. In a quiet environment, ambiguity grows loud. Without routine noise to mask uncertainty, every irregularity demanded interpretation. Silence amplified doubt. I responded by tightening control further. Movement windows shrank. Activity clustered into predictable patterns. The refuge operated like a held breath, everything suspended between necessity and restraint. The quiet didn't make me safer, it made me smaller. Living this way changed how I measured threat. Loudness became more frightening than proximity. A dropped object felt more dangerous than an unseen presence beyond the walls. Fear reoriented inward, policing my own actions rather than monitoring the outside. The silence fed on itself. The quieter the refuge became, the more disruptive any sound felt. Normal actions turned intrusive. I began delaying tasks simply to preserve stillness, even when delay introduced other risks. Silence had become a priority, independent of survival. I told myself this was discipline. I told myself this was adaptation. In truth, it was compression. The space allowed fewer and fewer expressions of normal behavior. The refuge demanded conformity to its quiet more than it demanded vigilance against intrusion. I noticed the psychological cost in small ways. Thoughts grew louder. Time stretched. Without sound to mark activity, hours blurred together. Silence removed feedback, making effort feel abstract and detached from result. I survived inside a vacuum of stimulus. The outside world, whatever it had become, felt even more distant now. Silence severed connection more effectively than walls ever could. I wasn't just hidden from danger, I was isolated from context. Safety requiring silence seemed reasonable at first. It felt like refinement, like mastering the final layer of concealment. What I didn't see was how silence narrowed my margin for error. Any disruption now carried disproportionate weight. Any mistake would stand out sharply against the stillness I'd built. The refuge had shifted again. It no longer just protected me from threats. It shaped my behavior to the point where deviation felt dangerous in itself. That was the quiet truth I didn't want to confront. When safety demands silence, silence eventually demands compliance. And compliance, once internalized, becomes its own kind of trap. The first sign arrived without sound. That was what made it unsettling. I noticed it during a routine perimeter check, a detail out of place enough to interrupt habit. One of the exterior markers I used to track movement had shifted. Not much, just enough to suggest contact rather than weather. The ground around it showed disturbance inconsistent with wind or runoff. Something had been there. I told myself it could have been debris. Animals, maybe. That explanation held until I reached the next marker and found the same inconsistency repeated. 2 points didn't make a pattern. They made a question. I stood still longer than usual, listening into the silence I had cultivated so carefully. Nothing answered back. I checked again the following day, approaching from a different angle using a route I hadn't walked in weeks. Another marker showed signs of pressure, faint but deliberate. The spacing bothered me. It suggested movement with intent, not drift. The refuge hadn't announced intrusion. It hadn't reacted at all. That meant either nothing was wrong or something had learned how to pass without triggering response. I reviewed my own behavior first. Predictable paths leave traces. Patterns teach observers where to look. The realization tightened something in my chest. If I had become routine, then routine could be read. The signals might not be from something trying to get in. They might be from something watching. Sound followed next, but not in the way I expected. Not impact or scraping, but absence. The usual background disturbances, distant wind shifts, small settling noises felt altered. Silence isn't uniform. When it changes, it means something is absorbing sound or interrupting flow. I couldn't confirm it, but the difference lingered long enough to unsettle me. I spent a full cycle doing nothing but listening, resisting the urge to move or investigate directly. In that stillness, I became aware of how much I relied on expectation. When the expected didn't arrive, my mind filled the gap. That made it hard to tell what was real and what was projection. Visual confirmation came later, indirect and brief. A shadow moved where no shadow should have fallen, too controlled to be light, too steady to be chance. It crossed a line of sight I had trusted for weeks, then disappeared before I could adjust position. The refuge remained unchanged. No alerts, no escalation. I checked internal systems obsessively after that, scanning for anomalies. Everything reported nominal status. Whatever I had seen didn't register as threat. That disconnect was more disturbing than confirmation would have been. The refuge protected against obvious danger. Subtlety lived outside its scope. I tried to rationalize again. Fatigue distorts perception. Isolation amplifies imagination. Silence magnifies nothing into something. All of that could be true. None of it erased the accumulation. Signals don't need to be dramatic to matter. They just need to repeat. I altered my routines slightly, breaking patterns I had followed for weeks. I changed movement timing, routes, lighting behavior. If something was watching, I wanted to see whether it reacted. The refuge didn't resist the changes. It adapted smoothly, masking the variation. The outside, however, responded. A marker shifted again, closer this time. Not enough to be confrontational, enough to be intentional. I stopped telling myself it was coincidence. The danger wasn't that something was out there. The danger was that I couldn't confirm what it was. Zombies don't test boundaries subtly. People do. People observe. People wait. That possibility reframed everything. Silence no longer just concealed me. It concealed them as well. The refuge had trained me to be invisible, but it had also made me blind to quiet threats that didn't announce themselves with noise or force. The safe place hadn't been breached. That was the problem. Whatever was happening didn't need to breach it yet. Signals that shouldn't exist don't demand immediate action. They demand awareness. And awareness was the thing I had let routine replace. I understood then that the trap wasn't just walls or dependence or silence. It was uncertainty introduced into a system that had been built on predictability. Once predictability cracked, safety became theoretical again. I didn't know what was out there. I only knew that something had changed and the refuge hadn't noticed. That meant it was on me to decide whether I was still safe or just undisturbed. For now. The moment I decided to reinforce the refuge, I convinced myself I was being proactive. Action felt better than waiting, and waiting had begun to feel dangerous. I told myself that strengthening defenses would restore the balance routine had eroded. I didn't stop to question whether the kind of reinforcement I chose would solve the right problem. I started by tightening access. Interior routes that once allowed multiple exits were narrowed into single paths. Furniture shifted to block secondary openings. Hinges were reinforced, gaps sealed, movement forced into predictable channels I could monitor more easily. On paper, it increased security. In practice, it reduced flexibility. Each change felt justified on its own. Fewer openings meant fewer vulnerabilities. Clear choke points meant easier control. I could defend what I could see. What I didn't account for was how those same choke points would behave if I needed to move quickly. Defense and escape began competing for the same space. Light discipline intensified. I reduced illumination further, closing off areas entirely to preserve darkness elsewhere. The refuge grew segmented, each section isolated from the next. Moving between them required deliberate transitions, pauses, checks. What once felt fluid became rigid. I gained control at the cost of speed. Soundproofing followed. I layered materials to dampen internal noise, padding surfaces until movement became nearly silent. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The refuge swallowed sound so completely that it became difficult to judge distance or direction. Silence no longer guided awareness. It erased reference. I reinforced externally as well, stacking obstacles in ways that discouraged approach but also limited visibility. Sightlines shortened. Angles disappeared. I could no longer see beyond certain distances without repositioning. The outside world became fragmented into narrow views that revealed less than they concealed. With every adjustment, the refuge felt more solid and more claustrophobic. Security improved against obvious threats. Subtle threats, however, became harder to detect. By reducing openness, I had reduced information flow. I was safer from intrusion and more vulnerable to surprise. The most critical mistake involved exits. I strengthened the primary one, assuming it would be the most likely path I'd need. Secondary exits were deprioritized, partially obstructed, made inconvenient to use. They remained technically available, which satisfied my sense of preparedness, but functionally they required effort and time I hadn't rehearsed. I told myself I would adapt if needed. That assumption rested on calm conditions. Under pressure, untested paths become traps. I didn't test them. Testing would have broken silence and routine. I chose preservation over rehearsal. The refuge accepted these changes without resistance. It didn't push back or warn me. Structures don't evaluate intention. They respond to force. I applied force inward, compressing space in the name of safety. The result was a shelter that demanded compliance rather than offered refuge. I noticed how my movement changed. I hesitated more, planned longer, moved slower. Every path carried commitment now. Turning back wasn't always easy. Decisions became heavier because they closed doors behind them, sometimes literally. The signals outside didn't stop. They adapted. Markers shifted again, farther this time, testing new angles. Whatever was out there responded to my changes with patience. It didn't rush. It observed. I realized too late that I was reinforcing against the wrong threat. I was building barriers for intrusion when the real danger was entrapment. My adjustments assumed I would always want to stay inside. They didn't account for the moment staying became the greater risk. The refuge no longer felt like a place I could move through instinctively. It felt like a machine that required correct input to function safely. Mistakes carried higher penalties now because margins were thinner. Security had increased, but adaptability had collapsed. I stood in the dim light and tried to imagine leaving quickly, navigating the narrowed routes, opening reinforced barriers under stress. The image didn't resolve cleanly. Too many steps, too many points of failure. Reinforcing the wrong way didn't announce itself as failure. It looked like progress. Stronger walls, quieter movement, tighter control. Only when I imagined the need to flee did the truth surface. I hadn't built a safer place. I had built a place that assumed I would never need to leave. That assumption didn't feel dangerous until the moment it mattered. By the time I understood that, the refuge had already changed shape around me, turning strength into constraint and protection into pressure. I discovered the cost of movement the first time I tried to leave quickly and couldn't. Not because something blocked the exit, but because the refuge demanded preparation before allowing departure. Every reinforcement I had added required reversal, and reversal took time, sound, and light. All things I had trained myself to avoid. I tested it cautiously, choosing a low-risk window when outside noise masked internal activity. The process still felt wrong. Barriers I had placed for security now resisted me, forcing deliberate steps where instinct once guided motion. Hinges groaned despite padding. Obstructions required lifting instead of stepping around. Each action consumed seconds that accumulated into hesitation. I stopped halfway through the attempt, heart rate elevated, not from threat but from friction. Leaving wasn't dangerous because of what waited outside. It was dangerous because of what I had built inside. The refuge no longer facilitated movement, it taxed it. That realization reframed the signals I had noticed earlier. If something out there forced urgency, my environment would slow me down. I would be negotiating my own defenses under pressure, undoing decisions made for a different phase of survival. The cost of movement wasn't just physical effort, it was cognitive load layered on top of stress. I ran simulations in my head, replaying scenarios where departure became necessary. Fire, structural breach, human confrontation. Each path required precision. Each mistake compounded. The refuge demanded calm to function safely. Urgency would break that requirement. I attempted another test later, this time rehearsing a full exit sequence. I timed it honestly, counting seconds instead of assuming competence. The result unsettled me. What once took moments now took minutes. Minutes were an eternity in a world where danger moved fast and without warning. I noticed how my body responded to the rehearsal. Muscle memory fought the changes. Hands reached for spaces that no longer existed. Feet hesitated at narrowed passages. The refuge had outpaced my instincts. Familiarity had been replaced with procedure. The outside environment hadn't changed during these tests. No new sounds, no visible movement. The danger wasn't imminent. That made the result more alarming. Not less. If this was difficult under controlled conditions, it would be disastrous under pressure. I considered undoing some reinforcements. The thought alone carried risk. Removing barriers meant noise, exposure, and time spent vulnerable. Reversal required commitment as much as reinforcement had. The refuge resisted change in either direction now. It had settled into its new shape. I recognized then that I had crossed an invisible threshold. The safe place no longer served as a flexible base. It had become a static structure optimized for remaining inside. Movement wasn't forbidden, it was penalized. That penalty extended beyond exits. Internal relocation took longer. Accessing stored supplies required navigating tighter paths. Even retreating from one area to another demanded planning. Mobility, once a survival asset, had become a limited resource. I felt the psychological shift immediately. Knowing that movement carried cost made me less willing to attempt it. I began postponing tests, telling myself I would rehearse later. Later never felt urgent when today remained quiet. That was the trap revealing itself. Not through force, but through inertia. The refuge didn't lock me in. It made leaving expensive. I returned to the center of the space and stood still, listening to the controlled silence I had engineered. It felt heavier now, not protective, but expectant. The refuge waited for compliance, not adaptation. Realizing movement had a cost didn't solve the problem. It clarified it. Every choice ahead would involve trade-offs I could no longer avoid. Stay too long, and the cost would grow. Move too soon, and I would pay in exposure and chaos. The balance that had carried me through 90 days no longer existed. Stability had turned inward, hardening around routine. Safety had acquired momentum, and momentum resisted change. I understood then that survival wasn't just about finding a safe place. It was about keeping that place from deciding how you were allowed to live. The refuge hadn't become a trap because something attacked it. It became a trap because I optimized it for the wrong future. The moment the refuge revealed its true nature didn't arrive with violence or intrusion. It arrived with a problem small enough that it should have been routine, a failure that demanded action rather than observation. That was all it took to expose what I had built. One of the internal systems faltered during a maintenance cycle. Not catastrophically, just enough to require immediate adjustment. Under earlier conditions, fixing it would have been simple. I would have moved freely, accessed the component, corrected the issue, and returned without incident. This time, every step toward the fix forced me through the same narrowed routes I had created for security. I moved deliberately, telling myself there was no rush. The system wasn't failing yet. But with each obstruction, the urgency crept in anyway. The refuge demanded precision to navigate safely, and precision slowed response. The problem didn't worsen immediately, but it waited, unbothered by my caution. By the time I reached the affected area, the issue had escalated. What could have been a minor correction now required sustained attention. I worked in constrained space, aware that retreat would take as long as advance. The knowledge changed how I acted. I hesitated more. I double-checked movements. Fear wasn't driving me, calculation was. When the fix finally held, I stayed still longer than necessary, listening. Not for threats outside, but for confirmation that nothing else inside had shifted while I was occupied. The refuge had become a place where attention could not be divided without cost. It required full focus to operate safely. That was when the realization settled fully. The danger wasn't that I couldn't leave quickly. It was that I couldn't respond quickly. Any problem inside the refuge now carried the potential to escalate simply because movement and access had been slowed. The trap wasn't passive. It was conditional. As long as nothing went wrong, it appeared safe. The moment something did, it demanded time I might not have. I traced the implications outward. Fire would spread faster than I could reposition. Structural damage would isolate sections before I could reach them. A sudden external breach would catch me mid-correction, committed to a path I couldn't reverse easily. The refuge had transformed risk from external to internal. I tested the realization with another scenario. I simulated an external approach, noise near an entry point. My instinct was to reposition for observation. The movement felt wrong immediately, too many steps, too many decisions. I couldn't observe and retreat fluidly anymore. Surveillance had become a commitment. The refuge resisted improvisation. It demanded adherence to prepared paths. That rigidity had been intentional when I reinforced it. Rigidity keeps threats out. It also keeps responses slow. I understood then that safety here was no longer something I actively maintained. It was something I complied with. The refuge dictated behavior through its layout and constraints. It didn't adapt to me. I adapted to it. That inversion changed the meaning of survival. Instead of reacting to the world, I reacted to the refuge. My primary concern shifted from what might happen outside to how the inside would behave if something changed. The signals I had noticed earlier took on new meaning. If someone or something was watching, they didn't need to breach the refuge to trap me. They only needed to wait until the refuge demanded my attention elsewhere. I stepped back to the center of the space and looked at it as if for the first time. The reinforced paths, the sealed secondary exits. The sound dampened walls. Everything worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. The trap hadn't closed suddenly. It had been assembled carefully, piece by piece, justified at every stage by logic and caution. By the time it revealed itself, it no longer needed to act. It simply existed. I realized then that escape, if it came, would not be spontaneous. It would require dismantling parts of the refuge under conditions that no longer favored dismantling. The place resisted change in both directions. The safe place had become a system that optimized for remaining exactly as it was. Stability had turned into inertia, and inertia had turned into control. The trap wasn't sprung by an enemy. It was sprung by time, habit, and the quiet belief that safety could be engineered once and trusted forever. Once the trap became undeniable, survival stopped feeling instinctive. It turned analytical, reduced to equations that measured cost rather than possibility. Every action now carried a calculation attached to it, not because resources were gone, but because freedom of movement had been spent. I stopped asking myself what I wanted to do and started asking what I could afford to do. Leaving one area meant committing to a sequence of steps that couldn't be reversed easily. Staying meant accepting growing risk from whatever problem might arise next. Even rest required justification, weighed against the chance that inaction would let something worsen unnoticed. The refuge demanded constant mental accounting, sound output, light exposure, energy use, path commitment, exit accessibility. None of these existed in isolation anymore. A single decision rippled through multiple systems, each one narrowing options somewhere else. Living had been replaced by management. Meals became calculations rather than relief. I ate to maintain function, not satisfaction. Eating too slowly risked fatigue later. Eating too quickly wasted preparation windows. Even hydration followed planning, time to minimize movement and noise. The body became another system to regulate, no different from power or storage. Sleep changed most of all. Rest used to restore clarity. Now it introduced risk. The longer I slept, the more I worried about what might change while I was inactive. I broke sleep into fragments, not because danger was immediate, but because responsiveness mattered more than recovery. Exhaustion accumulated quietly, accepted as the price of control. I noticed how rarely I laughed or even reacted emotionally to things anymore. Emotional response felt inefficient. Panic was obviously dangerous, but so was relief. Anything that disrupted calculation introduced error. I flattened my reactions to maintain clarity, trading range of feeling for precision. The refuge reinforced this mindset by punishing deviation. Any attempt to relax discipline created friction immediately. Movement felt heavier, decisions took longer. The space reminded me constantly that it functioned best when I treated it like a system rather than a home. I thought about life before the outbreak, about moments that required no planning at all. Standing somewhere without checking exits, speaking without measuring volume, moving without anticipating consequence. Those memories felt distant, not because time had passed, but because the conditions that allowed them no longer existed. Survival had narrowed into a series of acceptable choices. Everything outside those choices carried disproportionate risk. I could still act freely, technically, but freedom without margin is theoretical. One mistake would carry weight I couldn't absorb. I tested that truth accidentally when I dropped an object in the dark. The sound wasn't loud, but it shattered the quiet I depended on. My heart rate spiked instantly, not from fear of something outside, but from the internal disruption. I froze, listening, calculating response paths before realizing nothing had changed. The reaction lingered long after the threat passed. That was when I understood how deeply the trap had embedded itself. The refuge no longer threatened me physically. It conditioned me psychologically. I reacted to internal disturbance as if it were external attack. The line between protection and control had blurred completely. Living requires excess. Time, energy, space to make mistakes. Survival in the refuge had eliminated excess systematically. Everything fit too tightly. Nothing could move without affecting something else. The system worked, but it worked by compressing me into its logic. I still told myself this was temporary, that once conditions improved, I would dismantle what I had built and reclaim flexibility. But the longer I stayed, the more difficult dismantling became. Each day of compliance reinforced the structure mentally as well as physically. I realized that if rescue came or if escape became necessary, I wouldn't simply leave. I would have to unwind myself from the calculations first. I would have to relearn spontaneity under pressure, a skill far harder than discipline. Calculating survival instead of living kept me alive. It also hollowed something out. Survival without life becomes maintenance, and maintenance has no endpoint. It just continues until something breaks. The refuge had succeeded in one respect beyond question. It had removed chaos from my immediate environment. In doing so, it had replaced it with a quieter threat, existence reduced to equations that never resolved into meaning. I was alive. I was safe. I wasn't living anymore. And for the first time since the outbreak began, that realization frightened me more than anything waiting outside the walls. I used to think the rules of survival were fixed, something you learned once and applied forever. 90 days proved how wrong that assumption was. The rules hadn't disappeared. They had shifted, quietly, reshaped by time and repetition, until they no longer matched the instincts that brought me here. Early survival rewarded aggression toward uncertainty. You moved, you scouted, you tested limits because staying still meant being found. By the third month, the opposite had become true. Movement invited risk. Exploration introduced exposure. The same actions that once kept me alive now threatened the fragile equilibrium I had built. That shift didn't announce itself as danger. It arrived as logic. The refuge worked best when nothing changed. So I changed less. Stability became the metric by which decisions were judged. Anything that preserved it felt right. Anything that disrupted it felt irresponsible, even when disruption was necessary. I noticed how language inside my head adapted. I stopped thinking in terms of opportunity and started thinking in terms of tolerance. How much noise could I allow? How much light? How long could a system run before it demanded attention? The questions weren't wrong. They were incomplete. They assumed the refuge was the environment I needed to survive in indefinitely. The outside world, whatever shape it had taken, stopped influencing the rules I lived by. I didn't know if infected numbers had thinned or multiplied. I didn't know if human groups had stabilized or collapsed entirely. None of that mattered to the calculations that governed my days. The refuge had become its own ecosystem with its own laws. Those laws favored compliance over initiative. They rewarded caution over curiosity. They punished spontaneity by making it expensive. Over time, they trained me to hesitate in ways that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with habit. I realized that if I had encountered this refuge on the first day of the outbreak, it would have killed me. I wouldn't have moved enough. I wouldn't have scouted far enough, and I would have trusted walls before understanding what they protected against. 90 days of adaptation had made me compatible with it. That compatibility came at a cost. The rules had changed because I had changed. My threshold for acceptable risk had narrowed. My tolerance for discomfort had increased in some ways and collapsed in others. I could endure silence and isolation indefinitely, but the thought of sudden movement now unsettled me more than it should have. Survival had stopped being dynamic. It had become static. Static systems don't fail immediately. They fail catastrophically when conditions finally exceed tolerance. I knew that academically. Living inside it made the knowledge harder to act on. The refuge didn't care that the rules had shifted. It didn't care that they no longer matched the outside world. It functioned exactly as it always had. I was the variable that had adapted past the point of usefulness. I thought about the signals I had seen earlier, the subtle markers of attention beyond the walls. If something was watching, it didn't need to rush. Time favored patience. 90 days had already proven how effectively I could be conditioned by stability. That understanding reframed the past 3 months. The refuge hadn't saved me despite the outbreak. It had saved me because the outbreak was chaotic. Now that chaos had settled into patterns elsewhere, my rigidity here became a disadvantage. The rules that once protected me now restricted me. Silence, concealment, compression, all useful early on, had grown dominant. They crowded out adaptability. Survival requires both, but balance had tipped too far in one direction. 90 days changed the rules not by making the world safer or more dangerous, but by changing how I responded to it. The refuge felt secure because it shaped me to fit its constraints. That shaping was invisible until I imagined needing to do something it didn't allow. I stood in the dim interior and accepted a hard truth. The safe place had not failed. It had succeeded too well at a task it was never meant to perform indefinitely. If I stayed, the rules would continue narrowing. If I left, I would have to relearn how to live by different ones, under pressure, without preparation. Neither option felt safe anymore. That was the final shift. Survival was no longer about avoiding death. It was about choosing which set of rules would eventually get me killed, and whether I would recognize at that moment in time to act before the choice was made for me. The choice didn't arrive as a dramatic fork in the road. It took shape slowly, through accumulation, until it became impossible to ignore. Every calculation now ended the same way. Staying offered certainty. Leaving offered risk. What changed was how those words felt. Certainty had once been comforting. It meant predictability, control, and the absence of surprise. Now it felt heavy. The refuge guaranteed that tomorrow would look like today, and the day after that would narrow a little more. Nothing catastrophic would happen quickly. That was the problem. Certainty promised survival at the cost of momentum. Risk, on the other hand, no longer looked reckless. It looked alive. Outside the refuge, variables still existed that I hadn't measured or contained. Movement, uncertainty, and exposure carried danger, but they also carried possibility. The longer I stayed, the less capable I became of handling those conditions. I ran the scenarios repeatedly, not because they offered new answers, but because repetition made inaction easier. If I stayed, I could continue managing systems, preserving silence, maintaining equilibrium. I would wake, calculate, and endure. Years could pass that way if nothing forced change. If I left, everything would compress into moments. Decisions would have to be immediate. Noise would be unavoidable. Mistakes would carry real consequences. But movement would return agency. The rules would be external again, not enforced by walls and habit. What made the decision unbearable was that neither option offered safety. Staying meant slow entrenchment into a life defined by restriction. Leaving meant exposure to a world I no longer understood. Certainty and risk had traded their usual roles. Certainty threatened erosion. Risk offered renewal. I examined the refuge one last time as a system rather than a shelter. Its strengths were undeniable. It would continue to protect me from immediate harm. It would continue to demand compliance. The longer I complied, the more it would shape me to fit its limits. I realized then that certainty wasn't neutral. It actively changed me. Each day spent inside made tomorrow's departure harder. Risk, by contrast, would either kill me quickly or force adaptation. It would not allow stagnation. That realization clarified the stakes. This wasn't a decision about survival in the narrow sense. It was a decision about what kind of survivor I would become if I lived. One path preserved life by shrinking it, the other threatened life by expanding it. I felt fear rise when I imagined opening the refuge completely, undoing the reinforcements, breaking silence, stepping into noise and unpredictability. That fear wasn't new. What was new was recognizing that the absence of fear inside the refuge had been manufactured through constraint. Comfort had replaced courage without asking permission. I didn't decide immediately. Decisions made under pressure often reflect habit rather than intent. Instead, I began preparing for the possibility of choice. I mapped reversals carefully. I noted which barriers could be dismantled quietly, which would require commitment. Preparation itself felt like rebellion against certainty. The refuge resisted that preparation subtly. Every step toward flexibility felt dangerous, like undoing something that had kept me alive. That resistance wasn't physical, it was psychological. The system had trained me well. Choosing between risk and certainty meant accepting that certainty was no longer safe. It meant admitting that survival required volatility at this stage, not insulation. The outbreak had changed. So had I. I stood in the center of the refuge and understood that staying was the easier choice, not the safer one. Ease had become the real threat, lulling me into a future that demanded less until nothing was left to demand. Risk didn't promise survival. Certainty didn't promise life. The choice wasn't about bravery. It was about timing. Wait too long, and certainty would choose for me. Act too soon, and risk would overwhelm me. I didn't resolve it that day, but I stopped pretending the refuge was neutral. It had become an active force shaping my future, and allowing it to continue unchallenged was itself a decision. The trap wasn't just walls or silence or routine. It was the promise that nothing would change if I stayed. And I finally understood that nothing changing was the most dangerous outcome of all. The realization didn't arrive with clarity or relief. It came quietly, in the space left after I stopped pretending the refuge was still just a place. Survival had taken something from me long before I noticed it was missing, and the cost wasn't measured in supplies or safety. It was measured in how narrowly I had learned to exist. I thought back to the person who first chose this refuge. That version of me had been decisive, willing to risk exposure for information, movement, and advantage. Fear had been sharp, but it had pushed me outward, forcing adaptation. The refuge had protected that person long enough for discipline to form. Then discipline had hardened into constraint. What survival took first was range. My world shrank without feeling smaller. I still occupied the same physical space, but my acceptable actions narrowed until choice became maintenance. I didn't stop being capable. I stopped being flexible. That loss happened gradually enough to feel natural. It took my relationship with time next. Days stopped pointing forward. They stacked instead, identical, interchangeable. Survival became something I preserved rather than something I moved through. The future lost shape because the present never changed. It took trust as well, not in the refuge, but in myself. I learned to doubt spontaneity, to view impulse as threat rather than instinct. The skills that once saved me were reclassified as liabilities. That reclassification kept me safe here, but it would make adaptation elsewhere harder, slower, riskier. Most of all, survival took context. Inside the refuge, everything made sense because the rules were internal and enforced by habit. Outside, the world had continued changing without me. I didn't know which threats had faded and which had grown. I had traded awareness for insulation. The refuge didn't steal these things. I gave them willingly in exchange for certainty. That was the most unsettling part. Survival wasn't imposed on me. It was negotiated, one compromise at a time, until the terms no longer favored me. I realized then that traps aren't always built to contain bodies. Some are built to contain behavior. This one had reshaped me to fit its limitations so thoroughly that leaving felt unnatural, even dangerous. Not because the world outside was worse, but because I no longer practiced living in it. The outbreak had destroyed cities, systems, and lives. The refuge had preserved me by narrowing me. Both outcomes carried loss. I had survived the world falling apart only to risk disappearing inside something that worked too well. Understanding what survival took from me didn't answer what I should do next. It didn't offer redemption or escape. It offered awareness. Awareness was the one thing I had nearly optimized out of existence. The safe place was still there. It still functioned. It would continue protecting me if I let it. That was the danger. Survival without re-evaluation becomes stagnation disguised as safety. I stood in the quiet space I had shaped and let the truth settle without resistance. Survival had kept me alive, but it had also trained me to accept less and less life in return. If I stayed, that trade would continue. The story didn't end with escape or collapse. It ended with understanding. The refuge wasn't my enemy. It was my reflection, shaped by the choices I made when fear felt urgent and comfort felt earned. 90 days after the outbreak, my safe place became a trap, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too completely. What survival took from me wasn't something I could recover overnight. But recognizing the cost was the first moment in a long time that felt like choice again. And choice, more than safety, was what I had been surviving without.